Hey everyone, bit of a different video I'm making today. 2 days ago, I released a video titled The Edge of Fate Stealth Nerfs the DPS Changes Bungie Didn't Mention. In it, I talked about various damage sources from weapons to grenades to supers and how their base values had changed in my testing between the last time I tested them in the final shape and most recently in the Edge of Fate. Over the past day, it has come to my attention that a lot of this testing has errors in it, and as the results presented in this video have spread further and further throughout the community, the need to address these issues has become more and more apparent. We'll get to assessing my data in a second, but first I'd like to apologize. I made a lot of mistakes in my last video, probably more than any other video I've made by over an order of magnitude. Let me explain. First, while I did add commentary over my slides and make a disclaimer toward the end of the video regarding the confidence of my conclusions, I was reckless in the presentation of my data for a number of reasons. Primarily, I often spoke during my video with a tone or narrative that assumed that the supposed changes my testing showed did in fact happen. Normally, this is not a problem since my testing in the past has been fairly accurate, but with the amount of systematic changes to both my testing and the game sandbox that occurred this past DLC, it was irresponsible and misleading of me to describe the data this way within the context of this specific testing. Essentially, the video was disproportionately confident in tone against the certainty of the results. 2. While I did make efforts to discuss how it is unlikely that Bungie intentionally nerfed or buffed anything that I'm discussing, the title of my video and some of the language I chose to use during my presentation definitely implied otherwise, and I could have done a better job to make clear that this is more of a bug hunt video than anything else. While I'm sure my core audience knows that my intentions are never to mislead and always to construct, I more than anyone else am acutely aware of how the community reacts to bite-sized summaries with words like stealth nerf and Reddit/Twitter posts that miss the context of a 36-minute long video. While you might excuse some of these reactions as people wanting a reason to criticize Bungie, especially at a time like this, I've been around the block long enough to know how a video like this will be received, and I could have done better to mitigate these reactions. And 3. The errors themselves. My last video was part of a series of videos that I decided to make showcasing my 200GB, 500 damage source long testing session post Edge of Fate release. While most videos that have been released so far are within my wheelhouse, this video came about as a result of a new column in my spreadsheet that tracked whether or not a TFS damage source followed the parasite ratio, a column I admittedly didn't put much thought into. But when it blossomed into an interesting discussion about what base values might have changed post-patch, I failed to apply the same level of rigor that I normally do when it comes to other aspects of testing and went straight into making a summary video without double-checking my methodology or results. While you might find it acceptable that there are bound to be some mistakes when keeping track of hundreds and hundreds of damage sources across a patch, even with that in mind, some of these errors are just embarrassingly inexcusable by my standards, and for that I would once again like to apologize. With a heavy heart and head, let's assess the damage. Over the past day or so, I've dedicated myself to doing a second and third pass over any data that I claim to have had some change in my last video. To explain my methodology, the second pass uses the shooting range's visual total per damage source instance as a second comparison point, and the third pass tracks a specific large damage number, for example the initial strike of a storm grenade, and compares it directly to final shape footage. As for the data itself, I'm going to split it into 4 categories: items that almost definitely didn't change, items I'm not sure about, items that almost definitely changed, and items that had intentional changes as described by Bungie. Let's start with items that almost definitely didn't change. For these items, I'll attach an explanation of the error that led to an indication of a potential base value change in order to hopefully provide some insight into how this testing occurs and the challenges that can come with it. First, let's talk about wipe screen/rounding error. Let's say as a result of the number crunch, your new auto rifle does 22 damage per shot. When the wipe screen totals all these 22 damage bullets, it will report some multiple of 22, that makes sense. In reality though, your auto rifle might actually be doing 22.4 damage per shot. In the past, when numbers were in the thousands and millions, this loss of precision wasn't a major issue. However, post-crunch, the difference between 23 and 22 damage per shot can easily be a few percentage points, and when I'm multiplying these wipe screen values by a variety of factors, including new gear bonus removal, Templar wipe screen adjustment, and power delta adjustment, the error can compound until it reaches a point where it looks like some changes occurred. A lot of the low percentage changes that I cited in the last video I've confirmed to be a result of this kind of error, including all legendary primaries, Le Monarch, Revision 02 Burst, Rapid Fire Fusions, Breach GLs, Trace Rifles, Telesto, Aggressive LMGs, Rapid Fire LMGs, Swords, Thunderlord, Legend of Acreus, Witherhoard, Darcy, and Amplified Arcsoul. In a similar vein, both aggressive shotguns and lightweight shotguns lost precision when I started testing pellet shotguns using body shots instead of crits. A bunch of small numbers have increased error compared to one big crit number, and after verification of post-patch crit values, I can safely say that both these shotgun archetypes were untouched in the Edge of Fate. Templar, my testing boss of choice, also has some unique problems that cause errors. Specifically, any damage that has some sort of split impact and explosive component deals randomly reduced damage to Templar unless he's in his Ritual of Negation, where his body has fully risen up. Since I was aware of that fact during this patch of testing, I accounted for it, but the Final Shape reference footage I used to obtain base values for these damage types doesn't. As such, Rocket Sidearms, Edge of Concurrence, Exteris, Xenophage, certain Breach Gel archetypes, and Skip Grenades all looked like they were buffed, but were actually a result of me only shooting Templar at moments where he takes full explosive damage. This is a trend you'll continue to see as we cover more and more tests. In a lot of the Edge of Fate testing footage, I'm simply better at executing the tests, and that led to some of these supposed buffs I discussed in the last video. Next, we have testing variance error, which generally refers to how certain damage sources have a bit of randomness in their damage per instance from test to test. While some of these differences were definitely partially execution or circumstance based, most of them were simply we got a better RNG test this time or something along those lines, including the Prospector, Deathbringer, Dragon's Breath, Cloud Strike, Hammer Strike, Shield Bash, Daybreak, Nova Warp, Blade Barrage, Gathering Storm, Hammer of Soul, Thunder Crash, Arc Staff, Thermite Grenade, Arcane Needle, Fleshit Storm, and Grapple Melee. The last group of errors I want to talk about are the most embarrassing and egregious of the bunch. Let's start with Tessellation, Bolt Charge, Ignition, and Jolt. All 4 of these results were incorrect because I simply had an incorrect Final Shape reference value. Due to changing recommended power deltas during year 7, I wasn't even able to track down how I arrived at some of these Final Shape numbers, so I'm at a loss for words here. Really dumb mistake, but thankfully I still had some reference footage I was able to grab from some speedruns and other clips that I could use to confirm that none of these 4 sources were nerfed. The Leviathan's Breath error might be even worse. I just input an incorrect value into the instance counter in the weapons tab. I shot 13 shots in my testing footage, and I mistakenly put 14, making the damage per shot appear reduced. I made a similar clerical error when tracking base melee damage, forgetting to remove the 1.5 times compensatory multiplier that I used for Templar testing after moving to Riven, since the Templar wipe screen incorrectly reports 1.5 times less damage than you actually do. Finally, Chaos Reach also met a similar fate. While there's nothing wrong with the testing footage, I accidentally copy-pasted the Daybreak value directly underneath it into the 100 stat cell when duplicating a row in the spreadsheet, and I just left it there. Yeah, pretty dumb. With Two-Tailed Fox, I believe the reference Final Shape footage I used did not have Ember of Ashes equipped, which would explain the appearance of an increase in damage per shot in the Edge of Fate. After verifying rocket impact values, I can confirm that there was no such change. Anarchy is a bit of a unique circumstance because Templar has issues with Anarchy traps ticking him correctly if you stick traps to the front of his body. I chose to stick one trap on the ground in the Final Shape reference footage. In my new testing, I stuck both traps directly to Templar, but on the top and bottom of his body, ensuring that the line of electricity between the 2 traps ticks him. This resulted in both traps doing full detonation damage upon expiry, something that made Anarchy look like it got a slight buff when the actual double trap tick damage did not change between DLCs. Tractor Cannon is another example of a methodology or understanding difference. In the Edge of Fate, I realized Tractor requires you to fully face tank an enemy and aim at the right angle to do full damage. Comparatively, the Final Shape footage shows hugely variable damage between different Tractor shots due to range issues, even though the peak values I was able to compare from both tests were equal. As I mentioned in the last video, Swarm Grenades get a little weird with their damage reporting on wipe screens and scoreboards when you throw them too quickly, and in the Final Shape reference footage, I simply threw them too fast for them to register correct wipe screen damage. In my second and third passes of retesting, I made sure to track both submunition damage and slow-paced throws, which both revealed an insignificant difference between the grenade's performance across both DLCs. The Chaperone has an interesting error. I only tested it with the Roadborne active in the Final Shape footage, and because I relied on the Destiny Data Compendium's 17% precision damage increase value to obtain the base value of the slug's damage, I had an incorrect reference value to compare against. In reality, the Roadborne increases the Chaperone's damage by 22%, which explains the 4% perceived difference in base damage that I cited in the last video. This is nothing against the compendium, of course. You guys know how much I recommend it as a resource, but this is just an example of how a comprehensive suite of testing should always include base values and buffed values, something I've strived to improve on in the Edge of Fate. Hazardous Propulsion's Exodus rockets have perhaps the most embarrassing error yet. In my Edge of Fate test, I used thruster into a wall, and said wall ate some of the rockets in my volley, which resulted in the appearance of reduced damage for the whole volley. Yeah, I know, silly mistake to make. Quite a few grenades also had problematic reporting in the last video for a variety of reasons. For Void Spikes, Void Walls, Vortex Grenades, Threadling Grenades, Fusion Grenades, and Solar Grenades, I reported similar buffs for a lot of these because of a mix of both testing variance error and another embarrassing problem, using the wrong parasite ratio after the power delta change. For For those of you that know how the new spreadsheet version works, it automatically converts -10 testing into the relevant +0 value for comparison purposes. Unfortunately, when I first made the diff column in the abilities tab, I used the -10 value for parasite damage. While I corrected it to the +0 value for the vast majority of the spreadsheet, for some reason I just didn't change it for a good portion of the grenade rows, which led to them appearing to do around 25% more damage than they actually are. Pulse grenades were also untouched in the Edge of Fate. While I did mention Spark of Shock being removed from my testing, I hugely underestimated its impact on the total damage of the grenade, and after accounting for its removal, pulse grenade damage appears to be identical before and after the DLC. Finally, Glacier grenades are the last test that had some sort of obvious human error. Looking back at the Final Shape reference footage, the way I tested this grenade was just completely different back then. These days, I test by instant shattering under Riven's arm. Back then, half the nade didn't even shatter and Templar was allowed to auto-shatter, which completely changes the grenade's dynamic. While some things did change when it comes to shatter damage, that's not the reason that my video reported changes. Everything I've mentioned so far in this video I can basically confirm to be unchanged contrary to my previous video, but there are a few more things that I'd like to mention before we move on to the unsure section. Shadowshot Mobius Quiver with Orpheus Rig has expected individual tick scaling post-patch, but it's always had this weird chunking issue and some of the reported values on the scoreboard are still unexpected. Blade Fury also reports unexpectedly higher numbers despite its individual slash damage being at expected levels post-patch. I would wager on the side of no change for both these supers, but I'll likely revisit them for further confirmation in the future. I suppose I'll mention Lord of Wolves too, since I want to cover every item I mentioned in the last video. As I said before, its scaling is at expected values, and any increase that you see in the spreadsheet came from ignitions being included in the methodology this time around. And with that, we are out of the deepest part of the woods. Next, let's talk about a few damage sources that I'm kind of unsure of. For these items, I'll explain what is causing this uncertainty, but why I think a change might still have occurred. First up, we have Choir of One's projectile mode. In the past, Hipfire and Choir has yielded odd results, and after doing a second and third pass on the weapon, I can say that its Hipfire mode produces relatively consistent results in the shooting range that are only slightly reduced compared to its old spaced Hipfire result and an 8% drop-off, but the scaling on its individual number ticks are identical to before. I can also confirm that Choir also has the explosive damage issue on Templar that a few other weapons on this list have, which would explain the 32% number I saw earlier. All of this is to say, I do think that Choir Hipfire is different to some degree, as I was unable to reproduce the Final Shape result on non-Templar targets, but it's nowhere near 32% worse, and I'm not certain of how much exactly it differs by. Second, we have Incendiary Grenade. This grenade is extremely distance sensitive, and in the Final Shape reference footage I have, I'm not sure if the first grenade is close enough to Templar to produce the max damage tick I was looking for in my third pass. As a result, any buff that this grenade may have received is uncertain, since I don't have any Final Shape footage of an Incendiary Grenade definitely doing max damage. Third, we have Scatter Grenade. This grenade simply has too many submunitions and too much randomness for me to be able to reliably tell which number I should be looking at when it comes to tick comparisons, so I'll just leave its buff or nerf status as uncertain. Fourth, Lightning Surge. When retesting this melee ability on a shooting range boss, I saw consistently reproducible 26 to 27% increases per melee, but the biggest tick in the bunch only increased in value by 11% post-patch when comparing individual values directly. Of the two tests, 26 to 27% is probably the more reliable value, but again, not enough information to be sure. Fifth, Magnetic Grenade. Another damage source that Templar's weirdness has infected, and while base value tick comparisons show a decrease in damage, overall damage paints a different picture. Hence, I'm not really sure what's going on here, more retesting later. To wrap up this section, the last item I want to talk about is Icebreaker's Shatter Ignition value. After looking back at the Final Shape reference footage for this test, I was met with one of the weirdest testing variance issues I've ever seen. The ignition damage on Templar in this clip just varies by so much that I'm not even sure what to say. What I do know is that the new ignition value is identical to a base ignition at 676 damage, so I'm just going to assume that the old number was Templar being weird, and that Icebreaker's ignition probably hasn't changed. Now, while I have just bombarded you with data I was likely wrong about, there is light at the end of this tunnel. In this next section, I'll be showcasing what I think has actually very likely changed. Since I've no doubt eroded your trust when it comes to data reliability, for each and every item in this section, I will be providing direct evidence of my calculations, as well as video footage of both reference tests. Some more background info before we get started. The Final Shape tests are all first equalized to the Heresy recommended power level before applying the parasite ratio, meaning Echo's tests are multiplied by approximately 1.01 times, and Revenant tests are multiplied by approximately 1.005 times. On top of this, near the start of Echoes, some weapons were 25% weaker due to rotating surges, which was also accounted for in any test before June 25th. There was also a short period at the start of Heresy where surges were accidentally turned back on for raid and dungeon activities. I also accounted for this if any testing occurred during this period. Finally, all of these tests were checked for rounding error, meaning that even if I reduced an Edge of Fate instance value by 1, which would be the worst case scenario, there was still a significant increase or decrease compared to the expected value from the final shape conversion. Despite all this, however, I've learned my lesson. I will caution against saying these are definitive changes, and I forwarded all of this info to a Sandbox team member that is internally verifying the numbers. What I can say is that anything that might have been stealth buffed will stay that way, whether we're talking about Choir Hit Scan, Overture, or Outbreak. Only things that might have been accidentally nerfed will be adjusted accordingly if internal confirmation is made, which is great. First, Sweet Business saw its regular shot increase by 10 to 15% across all methods. Outbreak Perfected's regular pulse shot as well at max nanites saw an increase of 8% across all methods. Final Warning, its Mark Charge shot increased by 6 to 7% across all testing methods. Rapid Fire Shotguns I confirmed with both crit and body, plus 8% across all methods. Choir of One Hit Scan, plus 14% across all methods. Fourth Horseman, 11 to 12% across all methods, and I tested crit as well. Agar Scepter, minus 8% across all methods for specifically the high damage crit when Will Given Form is active, so the first nerf that we're going to discuss here. Dead Messenger confirmed that this is staying in the game. The wave damage has tripled because, you can do 3 waves at the same time now, but again, confirmed staying in the game. Pretty cool stuff. Deterministic Chaos, some variance in the numbers here, 10% on average per shot when including the entire package with weakened, volatile, everything. With just the weakened shot specifically when comparing tick to tick, that's 4% increase in damage, but again, potentially an increase in damage just generally here. Grand Overture, surprising. I honestly thought I made a mistake with this one, but after going through it for confirmations, you can see the math on screen. 20% increase across almost all methods. Heir Apparent, 15% nerf across all methods. Worldline Zero confirmed bug, 5 heavy ticks to just 1 heavy tick like we talked about, so technically minus 80%, but will be changed. Golden Gun, also surprisingly, 4% nerfed across all methods, potentially. Gunpowder Gamble, 20% nerf across all methods. And then finally, Song of Flame has had some scaling changes, which we'll discuss in a future video. That's just kind of a change I wanted to mention because it technically is a change across the patch. And one more thing. Auto shatters no longer scale with weapon type or source type like Scorch kind of does, right? So auto shatters are now all the same value, can confirm that. Last but not least, let's talk about what changes I can confirm did go through as a result of Bungie's directly mentioned changes, which deserve their own separate section. Devil's Ruin, 69% buff per burst due to the Pyrogenesis rework. Handheld Supernova did get a 20% buff, but could have received a bigger buff as well, because the tick comparison between Final Shape and Edge of Fate shows a 38% increase, which is potentially interesting. Heavy Burst Shotguns, 8% buff, as stated. Colony, overall, 15% buff. I believe Colony at some point got a 40% detonation increase, so I'm just saying 15% overall buff when combined with the impact as well. Fusion Grenade and Solar Grenade with Touch of Flame did both receive a 10% overall nerf, which is going back over what I said in the previous video, goes against that. Trip Mine Grenade, Flux Grenade, Storm Grenade, when accounting for Spark of Shock on the last two, 15% buff for all of them as stated in the patch notes. Glaive Melee, some people were commenting that they were surprised that this happened. This is technically, it wasn't even a stealth nerf in the previous video. I was just kind of going over, retreading old ground, because we talked about how Glaive Melee was going to get nerfed. Bungie said it was going to get nerfed. But just to confirm here, 50% nerf for Legendary, 63% nerf for Winterbite. Monte Carlo with Bayonet Locked, 175% buff, like we mentioned in the previous video. Storm Trance can confirm, 20% buff. And Consecration did get around a 13% nerf due to Ignition's not scaling with melee anymore, and of course Consecration had an intrinsic bonus to its ignition damage by default, and that's gone now as well. While a lot of these errors can be attributed to number crunch and other system changes, a significant portion of these mistakes were just that, human mistakes. While I'd like to think that my track record has been pretty good, the past few days have definitely opened my eyes to the additional challenges that arise when you're trying to compare two eras of your own testing, even if you do a good job of keeping archival footage. Looking back at some of the footage that I used to get Final Shape reference numbers for my last video, it's clear to me that at the very least, I've improved my testing standards when it comes to documentation and execution, but this difference in methodology definitely came back to bite me in several of these comparisons. That aside, I can only hope that this video can make amends for the potential damage that the last one did, and I'd like to thank the Bungie dev that reached out to me and kept an open communication channel in order to confirm some of my findings. I know that a lot of you trust me to do the heavy lifting when it comes to number crunching, and to hear that a huge portion of my reported results in the last video were inaccurate or misrepresented is probably disheartening. So what am I doing to ensure this won't happen again? First, anytime I report on sandbox base value changes, I will utilize the same spread of methods I referenced earlier in this video in order to confirm my results. I've learned that these are sensitive and error-prone tests, so I will treat them accordingly. Second, I will make an effort to diversify the bosses that I test on. A solid portion of the issues that arose when comparing Final Shape and Edge of Fate values came from Templar's incompatibility with consistent explosive damage testing. And while I've already started moving a lot of my splash damage testing to Riven, I will make an even greater effort to do so when necessary. Third, my documentation on test circumstances, execution notes, and item description has continued to improve over time, and I will continue to work on ensuring that my archive of testing footage becomes more and more reliable over time, so that when I do a sweeping retest like I did this season, there won't be nearly as many issues. And fourth, I'm working on changing my base value source to a massive multiplier activity or scenario to combat the number crunch change. What this means is that you might see me testing base value, not health bar damage, in Excision or perhaps the Ritual mission, where the Thread Cutter ×3 buff massively multiplies your damage so that rounding error becomes less and less of an issue. If you've made it this far in this video, I'd like to thank you for your patience and understanding on this matter. Going forward, we'll be resuming our normal video schedule, but for those of you interested in the deeper details of this testing, please have a look at the new tracker tab in my spreadsheet linked in the description, where you can see my second and third pass results, as well as the status of every item that I retested for this retraction video. Over the next day or so, I'll be redoing some testing and changing numbers in my weapons and abilities tabs in order to reflect the findings from this video, and then hopefully we'll be on to our next adventure, which should be stat scaling testing. Once again, I apologize for any confusion or misplaced frustration that I caused with the last video, and I will continue to work hard to make sure this doesn't happen again. Goodbye for now.